In the winter of 1950, high in the frozen mountains of North Korea, an entire division of U.S. Marines walked into a nightmare carved from ice, silence, and the kinds of shadows that only appear when death is close. This is the story of the Chosin Reservoir, a place where the temperature fell to minus 40 degrees, where men froze mid-breath, and where some Marines swore their rifles fired on their own. Not because of ghosts, not because of panic, but because nature itself, uncaring and merciless, had become a weapon. Tonight, I'll tell you what survivors saw, what they felt, and why some of them, even decades later, still woke up sweating, still hearing the ice crack behind them. This is their horror. It was late November 1950 when the U.S. 1st Marine Division moved into the high ridges around the Chosin Reservoir. They were told the Chinese army wasn't there. They were told it was a simple advance, but the mountains told a different story. Marines reported something strange on the very first night. Not an enemy, not movement, just silence. A silence so thick, even the wind avoided it. A silence that felt like someone holding their breath behind a door, waiting. One Marine, Corporal Andrews, wrote in his notebook, "It feels like the mountains are watching us." He wasn't wrong, because in those same ridge lines, hidden in foxholes cut into ice, nearly 120,000 Chinese soldiers were already surrounding them. Silent, frozen, waiting for the dark. The attacks didn't begin like normal battles. There was no warm-up, no distant artillery, no warning. Just a whistle, thin and sharp, slicing through the night like a needle. Then the hills erupted. Chinese soldiers came charging down the frozen slopes, thousands at a time, their silhouettes spilling over the ridges like black water. The Marines opened fire, machine guns rattling, mortars launching. But the cold twisted everything. Weapons jammed, oil froze, metal cracked. Some Marines smacked their rifles against rocks to keep the bolts from freezing shut. And over the screams and gunfire, over the blizzard winds and exploding grenades, men shouted something horrifying. "My gun's firing by itself." It wasn't superstition, it wasn't panic. The cold had become so brutal, so unnatural, that the metal firing pins froze in perfect alignment. If a Marine bumped his rifle on the ground, the weapon could discharge on its own. 1,000 tiny accidents waiting to kill friend or foe. Imagine the terror. Fighting an army you can barely see, in temperatures that break steel, while your own rifle threatens to betray you. That was just the first night. The cold didn't just kill, it preserved. Marines discovered Chinese soldiers who had been shot but still stood upright, frozen in place like statues carved from ice. Eyes open, hands still gripping rifles, frost clinging to their lashes like crystal cobwebs. Private Morales described one. "He looked alive. I walked past him, and his eyes followed me. I swear to God they did." He wasn't hallucinating. In temperatures near minus 40, the human body freezes so fast the muscles lock instantly. Some dead men remained standing until the warmth of the sun finally softened them, and they collapsed without warning. Imagine marching, tired, half awake, and a body suddenly falls next to you, a body that looks alive. In the frozen hell of Chosin, even the dead played tricks on the living. There's a story, one that veterans rarely talk about openly. They say you could hear screams echoing across the ice, but not all of them came from enemies. Sometimes Marines found their own wounded frozen in the snow, mouths open, faces twisted, as if mid-scream, frozen solid before the sound could finish leaving their lungs. One medic wrote, "I touched his cheek. It was like touching glass. His scream was still on his face. If that isn't horror, I don't know what is." There were moments when Marines swore they heard footsteps behind them at night. Not the chaotic running of soldiers, not attacks, just slow, steady footsteps. Crunch, crunch, crunch. When they turned, there was nothing. Just darkness, just snow. Some said it was their own nerves. Others blamed the ice expanding and cracking under the cold. But a few survivors always whispered something different. The dead walk here, not ghosts, just bodies the cold hasn't claimed yet. And in a place where frozen corpses stood upright, that explanation wasn't as crazy as it sounds. Every night, the Chinese launched human wave attacks, thousands charging with bugles and whistles, their sounds echoing across the ridges like calls from another world. The Marines described it as something primal, something ancient. Some Chinese soldiers wore white camouflage that blended perfectly into the snow, making them appear like pale, ghost-like figures rushing down from the mountains. And the worst part? Many were frostbitten, some were starving, but they still attacked with inhuman determination. One Marine said, "It felt like the mountain itself was attacking." When the Marines finally received the order to withdraw, they had to fight their way out along a narrow, icy road. The path soon earned a chilling nickname, the Gauntlet. Along the roadside were bodies, Chinese, Korean, American, stacked like timber, frozen stiff, faces twisted into expressions no living man could imitate. And because the ground was too hard to bury them, Marines placed bodies in sitting positions along the embankments, using them as markers. Silent watchers over the deadly road out. Imagine driving a truck through that narrow mountain pass, your headlights revealing row after row of frozen faces staring straight at you. Some Marines shut their eyes, some prayed, some couldn't look away. The cold had become so extreme during the final retreat that metal behaved like something alive. It expanded, contracted, snapped, and then it happened. Dozens of rifles began discharging in the night without being touched. A bump, a shake, a vibration from a nearby explosion. Bang, another. Bang, another. Marines scrambled for cover, unsure if it was enemy fire or their own weapons betraying them. A machine gunner reported his weapon firing a burst when he wasn't even behind it. Another Marine nearly died when a frozen M1 Garand went off after he dropped it on the ice. In journals written decades later, some still describe those gunshots as sounding wrong. Sharp, fast, metallic, like the mountain was spitting bullets from inside its throat. After 17 days trapped in frozen hell, the Marines finally broke through to the coast. Frostbite had taken fingers, noses, ears. Some men had feet so black doctors called them dead leather. Others were carried out on stretchers stiff as boards. But the nightmares? Those lasted far longer. One veteran interviewed at age 81 said, "The cold, it followed me home. Sometimes I still hear my rifle firing in the dark, even though I'm nowhere near the mountains." Chosin Reservoir wasn't just a battle. It was nature at its cruelest, war at its most merciless, and humanity at its most desperate. They say hell is fire, but for the men of Chosin, hell was ice. Ice that cracked, ice that killed, ice that made their rifles come alive in the night. And somewhere in those mountains, quiet now, abandoned, untouched, you can still find rusty metal buried beneath the snow. And if the wind hits just right, some say you can hear a sharp, metallic echo. A single shot, fired by no one. You know, when veterans of Chosin talked about the cold, they said it wasn't weather. It was a presence, something that pressed against their skin, seeped into their bones, and waited. And on that night, the night I'm about to tell you about, the cold wasn't the scariest thing anymore, because the valley started making sounds that no valley should make. Corporal Leland Hayes was the first to hear it. Not gunfire, not Chinese voices, not the snap of tree branches, but a scream, high, sharp, thin, like metal tearing through flesh. Except nothing was happening. Hayes was sitting in his foxhole, hugging his rifle, trying not to freeze. His breath hung in front of his face like white smoke. And then he heard it again, a scream, but the sound didn't echo. It just ended, as if something swallowed it whole. Hayes radioed command, whispering, "Hayes, did anyone hear that? Was that one of ours?" Command replied back, "Radio. No patrols outside the perimeter. Stay put." But the scream came again, closer this time. A few men were ordered to check the perimeter. Lance Corporal Miller, Sergeant O'Donnell, and two others trudged out with flashlights, boots sinking into snow so cold it squeaked. And then silenced. The world became dead quiet. like the snow itself was absorbing all sound. They found tracks, at first, boot prints that weren't theirs, leading away from the ridge. But the strange part, every other print was perfect, and the ones in between were smudged, dragged, like the person was lifted between steps. Miller whispered, "Miller, someone's messing with us, right?" O'Donnell didn't answer. He just raised his flashlight, and the beam landed on shapes in the snow. Not bodies, not equipment, shapes, like people crouched down, hugging their knees, heads tucked into their shoulders. Frozen statues, except these were made entirely of ice. Perfect outlines of bodies, perfect details, even the folds of jackets carved in ice. No one wanted to touch them, but Miller reached out anyway. The moment his glove brushed one, crack. The entire figure shattered into powder. Just dust. No melting, no chunks, no residue. Like the cold itself had carved a person out of snow. They radioed command, but before they could explain, bang! A rifle shot exploded behind them, then another. The men dropped into firing positions, but no one was firing. The shots were coming from guns lying in the snow, unattended, frozen solid, just firing again and again, at nothing. The flashes illuminated the forest in strobe light bursts, but there was something between the trees, silhouettes, tall shapes, not moving like men, tall enough that their heads nearly touched the dead branches overhead. Sergeant O'Donnell whispered, "Those aren't Chinese soldiers." As the guns fired on their own, the shapes in the woods began to sway. Forward, back, a slow rocking motion, and then they began to count, not in English, not in Chinese, not in any language the Marines recognized, but the rhythm, the cadence, felt unmistakably human. 1, 2, 3, 4, but deeper, scraping, like stone grinding against bone. The men fell back, stumbling. Snow filled their boots. Fingers went numb. Breaths turned sharp, and the counting grew louder. 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 Until it drowned out the rifle fire entirely. When the patrol finally made it back to camp, Private Willis was standing outside the command tent. Just standing there. Not moving. Not blinking. Eyes wide open. Snow crusting on his eyelashes. Miller approached him. Miller. "Willis, you okay?" "Hey." He tapped him on the shoulder. Willis's body tilted, just slightly, and then fell like a stiff board straight into the snow. He didn't bend, didn't react, didn't even grunt. His entire body was rigid, frozen solid. But the horror wasn't that he was dead. It was the expression. Willis wasn't screaming, he was smiling. A huge grin carved across his face, one that didn't belong on any living man, and his hands, icy, clawed, stiff, were holding his rifle tightly, the trigger pressed down by frozen fingers. Commander Yates walked over. He checked the barrel. It was still warm. Willis had been shooting after he was frozen. Hours passed. Men kept guard. The cold kept eating at them. And then everything stopped. The counting, the echo of shots, the shapes in the trees. Silence. Not ordinary silence. This was the kind of silence that pushes into your ears, makes them ring, makes you feel like the world has stopped breathing. But the Marines didn't relax, because one by one, the guns started pointing themselves, not firing, just slowly rising, tilting, aiming at the tree line, on their own, as if waiting for something, as if the valley itself was holding its breath. Then, the most terrifying thing of all, every single weapon, every rifle, every machine gun, even ones frozen into the snow, click their triggers back. Click, 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 resetting themselves, like they were preparing to start again. The men watched in horror as the tall shapes stepped out from behind the trees, and they froze when they saw them clearly. They weren't men. They weren't Chinese soldiers. They were people made of snow and ice, human forms, frozen faces, fingers curled, eyes empty. But their mouths, the mouths were slightly open, like mid-breath, like they'd been frozen while screaming. And when the moonlight hit their faces, the Marines noticed something even worse. Every frozen figure was wearing U.S. Marine uniforms. Uniforms from earlier battles, earlier years, earlier wars, lost men, men who had vanished, men who were never recovered. Sergeant O'Donnell whispered, "Oh God, they were here before us." One of the frozen figures stepped forward. Snow didn't crunch beneath its feet. It made no sound, just glided. It stopped 20 feet away. Then its jaw cracked, splintered, opening wider than it should. And in a voice that was not human, a voice layered with hundreds of whispers, it said, "Leave." The Marines froze. The valley echoed the word back, stretching it unnaturally. Then, the guns fired again. Every one of them. Every rifle. Every machine gun. Every abandoned weapon. Unmanned, unheld. Firing wildly into the trees, into the sky, into the frozen figures, into nothing. The valley lit up like lightning. Snow exploded in waves. Shell casings rained like metal hail. Men scrambled for cover. The weapons were firing until they overheated, until they melted their own ice, until they jammed or cracked or snapped. Only then, only when the last shot echoed through the mountains, did the frozen figures retreat. Silent, slow, vanishing back into the tree line, as if they had only come to give a warning. When dawn finally broke, the Marines checked the battlefield. No footprints, no ice statues, no shapes, no tall figures. Just snow, untouched, smooth, perfect, like nothing happened. But the guns were still warm.